The Jehovah's Witnesses just came out with a new article claiming that people hate them, that they're the victims of religious persecution. And while this narrative certainly isn't new, is it accurate? Do people actually hate the Jehovah's Witnesses? Or is it more likely that the organization has done something to warrant legitimate scrutiny? As a former Jehovah's Witness of 30 years, I want to address 3 claims made in this article. First, this claim that they are hated purely on the basis of religious belief. Second, the claim that they don't show hatred towards their critics. And finally, the claim that their persecution as Jehovah's Witnesses is special and is proof of divine favor. Let's get started. Claim number 1, we are hated because we worship Jehovah. No one hates you because of who you worship. It's far more likely that they don't hate you, but strongly disagree with some of your teachings and policies. And if they do feel that strongly, maybe it's because of the immense suffering that's occurred under your leadership over the course of several generations. A few but not limited to failing to protect children in your congregations by not following mandatory reporting laws, or doing so and then coercing the victim and their family into silence. Or maybe it's because your shunning mandate shows zero regard for the family bond, leading to countless broken families. All right, this is an organization that's trying to posit itself as the victim when they're actually the aggressor. I know this because I've been shunned for 8 years. All right, their institutional mandate to shun defectors proves that they want to censor and silence their opposition. All right, they're using these terms hate and hatred because they're struggling with a little something we like to call projection. Just because someone disagrees with your ideology doesn't mean that they don't respect your right to practice your beliefs. And to call that other person hateful, it's a stretch. Then the article goes on to say that it's Satan who blinds people to the truth about Jehovah and influences them to oppose those who do know and love God. All right, let me translate this for you. We live in the information age where people have the opportunity to make informed decisions. And the reality is anyone with a pulse and an internet connection knows too much about you as an organization to want anything to do with you. I mean, many have argued, rightfully so, that your manipulation of the scriptures while producing the New World Translation is blasphemous, a satanic maneuver in itself. And why does God's word need to be tampered with, if not to influence and deceive? The organization wants to use Satan as a scapegoat, then has the nerve to patronize people who have a way better understanding of the Bible than they ever will. It's farcical. It's also incredibly narcissistic. Even Christendom, the very churches that Jehovah's Witnesses rail against, have the humility to admit when they could be wrong, that God works sometimes in ways that we can't understand as humans, and in doing so, recognizes their limitations and cultivates trust with their parishioners. Of course, not all the time, not in all cases, but again, having been on the other side, more so than I can say for Watchtower. Other churches and organizations have joined redress schemes and even apologized for past crimes. The Watchtower organization, on the other hand, has employed every measure imaginable to protect those who've abused their positions of power, refuses to acknowledge the damage they've inflicted through their policies, and still, to this day, actively threatens any Jehovah's Witness who dares to challenge their gross lack of accountability. All right, Jehovah's Witnesses, you're not hated for your belief in a deity. The Jehovah's Witnesses are victims of atrocious leadership, right? Leviathan levels of pastoral mismanagement that has, in turn, justifiably garnered both the suspicion and ire of the general public. All right, give me a break. Watchtower doesn't need a boogeyman. They've earned their reputation all on their own. Claim number 2, we do not hate our opposers. The article relays the account of Jesus' execution, that despite the crowd calling for his death, he asked God to forgive them for their ignorance. It also mentions the disciple Stephen, who did the same before he was executed. On the surface, this seems very generous, right? We should be more like Jesus. Don't hate those who hate us. Instead, pray for them. Hope one day maybe they see the light and change their ways. That's very big of you, if that's where it actually ended. But if you look a little closer, really pay attention. Not only does it continue on this narrative that people who don't like the Jehovah's Witnesses are just poor souls who don't know any better, but it reassures Jehovah's Witnesses that they will, in fact, have the upper hand in the end, since key players in both Jesus and Stephen's deaths eventually repented, exercised faith in Jesus, and got baptized. And if you're not trained In the art of decoding Watchtower literature, this might again, on the surface, seem to be nothing more than a straightforward call to accept Christ. All right, allow me to decode. What they are actually saying is that anyone who rejects or has zero interest in being one of Jehovah's Witnesses would do well to change their mind, since being an official baptized member of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization is the only path to salvation and avoiding God's wrath. But hey, don't take my word for it. This is how they really feel about their, quote, opposers, straight from the horse's mouth.
The Isaiah prophecy book had some sobering comments, and they will go out and look on the carcasses of the men who rebelled against me, for the worms on them will not die. They're finally going to be gone. All these despicable enemies that have just reproached Jehovah's name, destroyed, never, ever to live again. Now, it's not that we rejoice in someone's death, but when it comes to God's enemies, finally, they're out of the way, especially these despicable apostates who at one point had dedicated their lives to God, and then they joined forces with Satan, the devil, the chief apostate of all time. But the wicked will perish. The enemies of Jehovah will vanish like glorious pastures. Particularly, they will vanish like smoke. So I thought this would be a nice memory aid. This verse stay in the mind. Here's what Jehovah's promising. Yeah. As Jehovah's enemies.
Far from being the oppressed victim in this scenario, it seems Watchtower is more than willing to condemn anyone who disagrees with them, not to mention bully their existing followers into submission. But this unhinged rambling from former governing body member Anthony Morris and the disturbing laughter afterwards represents only a small percentage of Jehovah's Witnesses. The majority of Jehovah's Witnesses, generally speaking, are not extremist in their views or actions. Jehovah's Witnesses don't go to war. They don't even protest. In fact, most are pretty friendly. Will offer to help you with some practical tasks. And again, generally speaking, they tend to have a sterling reputation on the job. Thorough, reliable, hard workers. And while I don't fault these individuals for what I'm about to say, I just know too much as a former witness to ignore their underlying motivations. The reality is, Jehovah's Witnesses are absolutely trained to keep a spiritual scorecard, and where they can't exert control over outsiders, they will do everything in their power to control their own. Anyone who tries to break free from the organization is blacklisted and smeared by the congregation and their own family, as illustrated earlier by that tasteless visual aid of snuffing out a life like you would extinguish a match. And by the way, this includes anyone who just wants to leave and move on with their life, not even someone trying to cause problems for the Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's the most telling part of all of this. By equating their struggles as an organization to that of Jesus' execution, they're basically calling anyone who disagrees with them the enemy, instead of what they are, people who just aren't interested. And by calling for their destruction, Watchtower blatantly contradicts the very love they claim sets them apart from everyone else. And finally, claim number 3. Their persecution is proof that they are in fact the one true religion. Hundreds of Jehovah's Witnesses are currently being imprisoned for their faith in several countries. These include Crimea, Eritrea, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, and Ukraine. These brothers and sisters have the right to worship in peace, and I wholeheartedly condemn their imprisonment. But does this alone qualify them as God's chosen people, as they claim? I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses are hardly unique in this way. There are countless Christians who are persecuted all over the globe for their faith, and they're just as sincere. I have zero interest in theological debate who's the correct religion as much as I'm incensed by Watchtower's hypocrisy. As they try to raise awareness of this persecution on their website, they cite Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, namely, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, going on to say that Jehovah's Witnesses are denied this right, facing unjust imprisonment and mistreatment for practicing their faith or for conscientiously objecting to military service. However, they selectively omit the next portion of Article 18 that states no one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair his freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice. The Awake magazine, the sister magazine to the Watchtower, made a similar statement to Jehovah's Witnesses in July 2009, where it states something very similar. No one should be forced to worship in a way that he finds unacceptable or be made to choose between his beliefs and his family. Again, having been on the other side, the problem is you have to understand the context in which this was written. This sounds like a very generous clause, but what they're referring to is people who are studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. They have the option to quit their Bible study, to no longer continue on their path to becoming Jehovah's Witnesses. However, this does not apply to Jehovah's Witnesses. To someone who wants to leave, someone who is born into a Jehovah's Witness family and decides that it's not for them, they don't want to continue in their family's footsteps. In this case, if an official, card-carrying Jehovah's Witness decides they no longer want to be recognized as a Jehovah's Witness, whether they were born into a Jehovah's Witness family and were pressured from birth, or maybe they converted as an adult and later changed their mind, the outcome is the same. They would be punished immediately, shunned and cut off from their families, which makes this even more hypocritical and infuriating. The organization wants to call foul when the government takes away their rights, but fails to mention how they take away that very same right from others. In fact, in recent years, Jehovah's Witnesses have come under intense legal scrutiny in Norway, Sweden, and France, to name a few, for inflicting, quote, psychological violence, threatening both minors and adult parishioners with shunning and separation from their families if they ever leave the organization. Again, denying others the very freedom they claim to be fighting for. So no, on balance, no one hates Jehovah's Witnesses. Unless you've been directly affected in some way, no one even thinks about you guys. However, thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses are staying in the organization out of fear of their own religious leaders. And words like hate and hatred are being used to galvanize what little radical base they have left. It's a propaganda strategy to create a fire where there is none. More so, to deflect and shut down any legitimate concerns or criticisms over problems they've created. But they're losing miserably as more and more people wake up and make that trade every day. Fine, go ahead and shun me. I'm not going to support this lie anymore. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this content helpful. If you'd like to know more about the Jehovah's Witnesses from a former member of 30 years, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.